welcome back, everyone. You're stuck with me for another session, but I think we now have a panel on generative AI and the future of free speech. Obviously a topic that is top of mind for everyone in every panel at every conference around the world at the moment. But you're here with us, with three of the leading experts that I would love to be talking about this particular issue with. So to my right, we have Neil Chilson, who's head of AI at the Abundance Institute. We have Sarah Shirazyan, who's a director of GenAI policy at Meta and a lecturer at Stanford Law School, and Anupam Chander, who is a professor of law at Georgetown Law School. It's a pleasure to be up here with all of you and really getting into, I think, some interesting issues about whether looking at AI, generative AI is one subset of AI, and its impact on freedom of expression, and perhaps how that is similar and different from the discussion that we just had about social media and other digital services. So kicking things off, first, I think when it comes to AI and any discussion about it, it's important to define our terms. And so I wanted to ask Neil to first talk just a little bit about what we mean when we say AI. And then also, because of course we're a few weeks out from a fairly consequential election here in the United States in the year of elections around the world, where there's been a lot of talk about the risks to electoral processes from the use of AI, something you've been monitoring. What are we actually seeing? What can we observe? And what does that mean?
Well, great. It's great to be here, and I'll start with the easy one, which is defining AI. I'm joking. That's basically impossible. There's no consensus scientific definition of AI. In fact, the leading textbook has 4 categories of definitions. Artificial intelligence blends, the person who coined the term, the computer scientist, says that every time that something works, they stop calling it AI. And so you can think of AI as primarily sort of the frontier of computer science. When I was a kid, when I first got interested in AI, cutting-edge AI was chess programs. Then it moved to voice recognition and optical character recognition. And these are all things that now your phone does. We heard algorithm about 1,000 times in the previous panel. Algorithms and AI, there's a huge amount of overlap there. And so it's very difficult to write a definition of AI that doesn't include also most of regular computing and certainly most of the things that your phone does functionally. But in this context, we're often talking about ChatGPT and generative AI, which is a sort of subset of this. It's not the only application of these particular tools. There's a ton of applications of these new technologies, for example, in the healthcare space, that don't necessarily raise speech implications. But for the purpose of this panel, let's talk about ChatGPT style generative AI, where you put in a prompt and you get back a content-created result, whether that be a text, an image, maybe a song, some of the new ones that are coming out. And that's sort of the big picture type of AI that we're talking about. And that is the one that post-ChatGPT being released, I think drove a lot of concern around the election cycle. Some of this was just a porting of the social media concerns directly into the new technology without really a lot of deep thought about how those two different technologies are quite different. We can talk about that later. But that has driven a lot of the conversation, concern about how generative AI might be used to do misinformation and disinformation in elections. I was part of lots of projects that got spun up all across the political spectrum, very worried about how this might affect elections, and so far, really not a ton of impact, practical impact of these technologies on elections. Jakob previewed some of this yesterday, that internationally, there have been incidents, there have been uses, but there haven't been a ton of impact on the outcomes of elections. So at the Abundance Institute, we've been running something called the AI Elections Observatory.com. You can go to it. And it collected about 40,000, at this point, 40,000 different media hits talking about the use of AI in elections in the US. We're focused on US elections for this particular project. And the impact there has been, our goal has been to identify uses, new instances of uses. Obviously, there's lots of duplicates in these 40,000 articles. There haven't been that many. The most prominent one is still the first one, which was the use of generative AI to create a Biden robocall during the New Hampshire primary. And that one got a lot of traction. Didn't really have any effect on the primary, and the person who did it faced criminal penalties, and I think that case is still ongoing. There's been some other examples, and we focus on sort of how do campaigns use this, and there really haven't been that many. There were some organizations that were ancillary to the DeSantis campaign that used some generative AI technologies, or more recently there was a Indiana senator who used generative AI, possibly. It's actually not quite clear, and this is a common theme across it. It's hard to tell whether or not you could do this sort of thing that's happening with conventional tools, or if you needed generative AI to do it. And so that's kind of the landscape. Not a ton on the direct impact. On the cultural side, tons of use of generative AI. Tons of use to create funny memes criticizing presidential candidates or public figures, or lots of that. And you've probably seen a ton of those. Sometimes they're entertaining, sometimes they're offensive, but they're clear political speech in a way that I think has been robust and very interesting in many ways. Maybe that raises some concerns, but it does look like the purest form of political free speech. And so that's sort of how we've seen it thus far in the election cycle.
So thanks very much for that. I think helpful to clarify our terms. We often gravitate towards, I think, the risks of harms posed by these novel technologies, especially not just in the context of elections, but also, of course, in the context of things like non-consensual intimate imagery, deep fakes that can be used for abuse and harassment and bullying. But AI and generative AI can also be a tool in the toolbox to work against those types of risks and to be used for other benefits. And so, Sarah, this is something that you've recently written about a little bit. So wanted to get your thoughts on where there are opportunities for generative AI to advance free speech in particular, since that's the topic we're here for, but also other human rights as well.
Thank you, David, and thank you for having me as part of this panel, and thank you, Jacob, for invitation. I think we, in trust and safety community, generally wired to only think about risks. My family never likes when someone is telling me I'm going to X country and I sort of say all the risks that they're going to be exposed to. But that's how we are wired. And I think that has been a challenge also when sort of we all kind of get exposed to GenAI as a technology. But we have missed, like, the public debate has been very, very vibrant for near-term and long-term risks of the GenAI, but we haven't done a good job of thinking about what are the benefits. And it's not about just thinking about what the benefits for the sake of the public discourse or improving the public discourse, but it's also important because unless we really think about it, debate about it, we're not going to harness those. So I think that's kind of the first thing. And it is my view that essentially GenAI and broadly AI can empower and advance every human rights and freedoms, like depending how you're looking at it. Just let's think about AI's role in sort of predicting global diseases and what it can do to prevent, so that will help people's right to health. Or if you think about how humanitarian organizations can sort of harness the power of big data and then helps with a host of rights, but including the right to adequate housing by analyzing where they should put the refugees. So there are very, very many ways in which I think there is going to be a lot of advantage with this technology. But sort of zooming back to the free speech and the topic of our conversation, I think there are probably two areas that I am already seeing benefits and I'm optimistic. One is generally in the sort of free expression and access to information. And I think there are kind of subcategories under that three I would highlight. One is the GenAI is really helping us exercise our rights in a couple novel ways to instant access information and exchange ideas. Like you can ask ChatGPT, Meta AI, Claude, pick your favorite chatbot, and ask questions and get information. And I think what's different there compared to sort of more static Google search is that you're getting more personalized information, and it helps you to get consume information and access information in a more intuitive, in a more engaging way. So that's number one. Number two, I think there's a lot of potential around sort of like expression or artistic speech and satire. You were already alluding to it. And we know that satire and artistic speech is very much protected, but it also, especially in autocratic countries, it's one way to challenge institutions and people. So that's another angle. I'll give you one example. There is an GenAI art that is making parody of politicians who are promoting anti-LGBTQ bills in the United States. That's second. And the third element I think that's going to be important is democratizing knowledge and skills. And this is really important for smaller NGOs, for sort of community support organizations, because they're going to get resources and skills that was only available before to bigger sort of organizations. Think about graphic content, like how, sorry, not the graphic, the engaging content, or think about like coding skills. So that will help organizations to convey their messages better and explain their social causes. There is one interesting example that is called This Climate Doesn't Exist. It's a project that is run by scientists who basically create personalized photos to show climate impact and really raise awareness about climate change and really overcome barriers to action. So I think that's there. And the last thing I would say before I pass to my colleagues is in the space of content moderation and more broadly trust and safety, and you have been, your organization have been writing about this. AI has been obviously really important to scale content moderation more broadly. We've heard in the previous panel that it's impossible to try to do that with the scale that the companies are operating. But I think what we're seeing in GenAI, we have been doing some tests where we see we were able to train our models, LLM models, on our Facebook's community standards, and we've seen much more promising results compared to machine learning. So I think that's also a place where there is a promise. That's all.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for mentioning. So at the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, we just published a report last month on the uses of AI and automation. So the sort of full spectrum of different automated technologies for trust and safety, sort of looking at how these tools are used by teams in the work of content moderation and broader work to keep people safe and enable them to have a kind of experience that allows them to express themselves and engage online. And I think not only does this provide, one, we see improvements in terms of compared to traditional machine learning, as you mentioned, but also increasingly, I think there's the ability to shield the humans who will continue to be involved in this work of content moderation and trust and safety from having to be exposed to some of the worst and most traumatic imagery again and again. So there are things we can automate there that will make things better, but really appreciate that sort of broad and optimistic look at some positive potential uses for this technology. So turning to Anupam, I think one of the things that we often think, and it's come up in the previous panel and elsewhere that more transparency, more openness is almost always the right answer when it comes to encouraging expression and the enablement of rights. When it comes to generative AI in particular, there is a big debate about open source versus closed or proprietary LLMs, and that's not always easily, it's a complicated distinction. But there are risks posed by openness, and there may be some risks posed by transparency in this case, and I was hoping you could help us kind of think through those.
Great. Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Jakob, and thank you to the Vanderbilt University for hosting this amazing conference. I've learned a lot. So I want to begin, I'm going to get to your question, but I'll begin with kind of picking up on a string of thoughts over the course of the day, which is about kind of disinformation campaigns across the world. I wanted to remind people in the room, in case they hadn't followed this news, that a few years ago, during the height of the pandemic, one government, governments engaged in disinformation across the world with respect to pandemic issues. And one government said this foreign government's vaccination for COVID is actually dangerous and you shouldn't use it. And they even suggested to this country that had a large Muslim population that the vaccine was made with pork products and therefore was haram, was not permissible under Islam, which was a very controversial and probably false statement about what that would be if that were even the case. So I'm just going to ask a question. If I said that this occurred in the Philippines, would people know what I'm talking about? That is, so Reuters reported a few months ago that the United States carried out a campaign to label the Chinese vaccine unsafe in the Philippines. Okay, so you may be surprised to hear, we've heard a lot about global campaigns for disinformation and misinformation, but Reuters and other newspapers in the United States, you can look this up, please fact check me, you should fact check everything that you hear. And so that's what I want to encourage you to do, is just look up this remarkable news, right? So we literally ran a campaign to stop people from using vaccines, possibly leading to excess deaths in those countries. Okay, so that's an aside to your question, but I want to get to it. I want to get to your question in this oblique way, which is that AI, of course, possibly supercharges disinformation, misinformation campaigns, et cetera. But there's a lot that you can do with regular old Photoshop or just running old video clips or video clips from somewhere else, et cetera. Those often can be extremely helpful, or spreading things through traditional tools like saying this vaccine is unsafe, even if you have no evidence that it's unsafe. And so we should be cautious when we move towards a kind of being alarmed at the prospect of AI disinformation, that we don't forget that this is a constant presence, both in US practices, Chinese practices, Russian practices, Iranian practices, et cetera. Now, what we've seen is, I want to turn to a second example, which now more directly will answer your question. So OpenAI, also this summer, reported that it had identified disinformation accounts from Iran that were using ChatGPT to spread disinformation. And so the question is, how did OpenAI know this? How did OpenAI recognize that ChatGPT was being used for these purposes? Well, OpenAI runs its system on its own computers. So when you use OpenAI, you're using it via an API, typically, to get to its computers. And so it can actually see, it has visibility into what people are doing. And so it is actually, in this case, literally investigating what uses its users are making of its system in order to identify what it believes are wrongful uses. That's what leads it to be able to identify this misuse of ChatGPT for this Iranian disinformation campaign. Okay. Now, imagine instead an AI model that you can download from GitHub or Hugging Space or some other website, and then run on your own computers. Once that model is in the wild, it cannot be controlled, right? So OpenAI and the proprietor of that model lose insight into how that model is being used out there. So that is the risk that's raised by what we often describe as open source models in this context, models that can be deployed on third-party servers that therefore can no longer be monitored by the proprietors, the producers of those models. That raises its own disinformation campaign concerns, et cetera. Now, on the other hand, of course, this is a complicated question. I would, of course, be remiss in not saying the fact that you can examine that underlying code, the fact that you can take the model, bring it home, and check it out, also might allow you to investigate whether or not that model itself is producing disinformation. So it allows a kind of transparency that can be useful. But my point here is simply, it's a very complicated mix, and it's very hard to know. But my other point is simply, let's also not excuse the United States from any of our errors, and not forget that this even happened. And so just the shocking fact that most people had probably very little idea what I was talking about, right, in this room, which is among the most educated in the country on issues of misinformation.
Very important principle to keep in mind. So one of the things that springs to mind from all of your comments is you often hear, particularly from politicians, but from others as well, that we need to get AI policy and regulation right because we got social media wrong. And so I think there's a question about whether that is true, but also how similar is a chatbot, for example, to a social media service or other service? And are we thinking, is this the right analogy? Especially when we think about expression, are these fundamentally different things that need to be thought of in different ways?
Well, I've actually heard it even broader than that we need to get AI right because we got the internet wrong. And when people say that, I look around and I'm like, the internet is pretty great in many ways, right? Obviously, it's changed a lot of things. But when I think about social media and comparing it to chatbots like ChatGPT, if you look at just the basic characteristics in the business models, they're radically different. So I think they really do raise really different types of problems. A few examples in the ways that they're different. The network effects in something like a open source or even a closed source AI model are very weak. We have network effects on social media where if I use it, it's more valuable if everybody else is using it. That's not really true for models. That's why it actually is quite useful if you have on-device models like Apple is developing that you can just run on your phone. You don't need everybody else to be using that model. Now, there are some weak network effects because the data that's used to train it is created by lots of people, but they're much weaker than they are in the social media space. So that suggests that the industry structure could be a lot different, right? We don't need winner-take-all companies in this. We can have a lot of different models. And in fact, I think Hugging Face has 400,000 different models right now. And so we can have lots of different models, and that's good. Another way that they're very different is the feedback loops are really different. If I post something on Twitter and it disappears, and I don't know why it didn't, or it doesn't take off, it doesn't get the traction I was expecting, I don't really know why. I can't really test that result. There's not really a good way to test that out. If I type into Gemini, to throw Google under the bus here. If I type into Gemini, give me pictures of the founding fathers, and they give me something that is ethnically diverse and interesting, but not quite historically accurate, that feedback loop is really strong. Like, I can tell right away that's a problem. Something's going on here. Why did it give me that? Not only is it, convey something to me, it's also extremely memeable when you can post it online. And I think that's why that feedback loop works so fast in that particular case. And another big difference is that, unlike social media, which is often, I think targeted advertising creates a ton of value. So I don't think that a business model is necessarily per se problematic. But unlike that type of business model where you get advertisements and you use the industry, use the tools for free, much of these models are pay as you go. They're subscription models. And there, the feedback loop, again, is very tight to the company. And their interests are often aligned with your interests in keeping you happy rather than keeping the other side of the platform happy, the advertisers. And so those are just some ways in which I don't think we can take the direct policy implications of social media and try to map it onto this. I'll just add one more thing really quick, which is that when people say that we got social media wrong, I actually have a big concern about this, because what they mean is that in the early days of social media, there was not a lot of trust and safety. We got used to using social media a little bit like the Wild West, and when there started to be more clamping down on what content could be on there, it felt unusual. I'm a little worried that AI is born, these chat models are born right now into a space that is replete with people who are very cautious about their model being used to generate something bad, and that they are putting in all of that caution into these models, and that we're all going to get used to that, and we will have an experience that is useful, but maybe more tame and less radical than it could have been if we don't encourage the companies to really take a view that actually a broad range of products and outputs from these models is actually very useful for free speech purposes.
I'm also mindful that there's a difference between the model, the large language model, and then the applications and how that model is applied, whether that is in a chatbot like ChatGPT or in more sort of tailored kind of applications. And I'm curious, and Anupam or Sarah, whichever you would want to come in, whether you see that there should be, where in the sort of stack some of these questions are best addressed.
Happy to jump in, but I just want to step back a little bit, because I felt what you were saying was the music to my ear in a way. So when the whole GenAI, quote unquote, revolution within trust and safety community happened, that everyone suddenly became everyone from trust and safety community became suddenly AI experts, I put together my team and I was like, can we all brainstorm and understand what are the differences? And sort of like we really kind of brainstormed what are the differences. There are quite many differences. And I'm not arguing we shouldn't at all draw from what we know broadly in trust and safety, but just kind of applying that to AI, GenAI, I think it's lazy. That's my personal opinion. But I'm glad you asked this question, because I actually pulled that document that I haven't for a while, so that was useful. But to your question, I think one way I was thinking about this issue is sort of the nature of the technology from more of a speech perspective. It's really non-deterministic. So what it means, like, we all can ask the same exact question and we will get different answers. So they can be completely different. They can maybe say the same sort of thought, but it's not going to be one-to-one the way we have generally in social media. And I think that has implications about how we think about rules and how we govern govern sort of the application, sort of on the output and model training level. If it was, I think like social media is generally designed to on a more deterministic logic. So there are sort of like, when it comes to enforcement, and if you're using AI, there are certain sort of words that the AI can capture and sort of like decide that this specific content, let's say if it's it needs to be demoted in your feed, then we will do that. Or if it warrants some like hate speech or whatever, then you will remove it. I think that's different in the case of in a chatbot experience. And the mental model I had was, if you apply kind of freedom of expression, human rights perspective, what it does it say? It says like you have the right to everyone has the right to freedom of expression, which includes access to information. Your opinions cannot be restricted, and you can impart any sorts of information from anywhere. So, but it's not an absolute right? So it can be restricted sort of in the protection of other fundamental values, and they're all sort of like the balancing test and three-part test. But the reason I'm saying this in my head is like, how are we thinking about the rules that govern what kind of output the system can say, especially in one-to-one setting? To some degree, you may argue, well, I'm having conversation in a private space, and I'm informing my opinion. So from that degree, maybe the type of speech that the model can produce is different and more permissive from the speech that we are putting out in the distribution, where we are kind of engaging with other rights and maybe affecting other rights, and that's maybe where the balancing act comes in. So I think that's kind of the mental model I have in my head. And I think we as a community need to do more thinking about how trust and safety in AI is different from trust and safety in social media, and don't just use the same exact terms and models, so we're not lazy.
Can I pick up on that? So I want to just cycle back a little bit to the question of we got the internet wrong, and so we don't want to get AI wrong. So I think there are substantial differences between the internet and AI, and the law will operate differently in this space. The last generation of internet regulation was really about how internet companies mediated our speech, our actions online. The AI services that we're seeing, this new generation of ChatGPT and et cetera, they're directly answering questions. They aren't mediating speech of others. They are trying to give you some kind of version of truth, even if the truth they give one person may differ than the truth they give to another person. Okay, so in other words, they are themselves making decisions about what they want to tell you about the world, not just here, these are the array of possible things that other people have said. And so I think that makes it very different. And so what you saw in the 1990s in the United States, when we apparently got it wrong, was liability limitations. Section 230, the DMCA Title II in particular, that really reduced the legal exposure for the act of intermediating the speech of others. That's what Section 230 is about. That's what DMCA Title II is about. It says, hey, online companies, when you're mediating the speech of others, they're going to say bad things, okay? And they're going to commit copyright infringement in mass scale. And so if we allowed that liability to persist, then you wouldn't have, you wouldn't be able to survive, because you'd just be fighting lawsuits every day because of all the things that human beings do, right? Section 230 is not an issue here. Section 230 is not available for OpenAI. OpenAI doesn't turn to, Google Gemini doesn't turn to Section 230 to defend itself from lawsuits anymore. That's because it's OpenAI speech, it's Google speech, it's Microsoft speech, and that's a totally different liability landscape that these companies face. So I don't think we're moving into a world where we're making the same mistake if that was a mistake. And I actually agree with Neil, it wasn't a mistake, as you might have kind of gathered from my description of what would happen in the 1990s, because I don't think we would be sitting here. First of all, I literally wouldn't be sitting here because I wouldn't have even come across Jacob Machangama until much later than I did. I found him through probably Twitter, and I found his podcast. So he had a podcast maybe 8 years ago. I don't know how many years ago it was. But he has this brilliant podcast, but I found it because he decided, a researcher in Copenhagen, decided to put up a podcast that I, a scholar in maybe then, in Washington, D.C., or maybe even in California, depending on exactly the year, found, right? And that was the magic of the internet. That's the magic of Section 230 that made it all possible, that the podcast hosts, the podcast company didn't have to worry about checking what, Jacob is going to say in his podcast, vetting it to make sure that there's nothing actionable in his podcast. That's what Section 230 did. It removed the podcast host's worry that he was going to say something bad. So basically, you can now host a lot more speech than you could if you had to vet everyone, if you had to be a standard newspaper publisher, like the Tennessean, which reviews every word that goes on its page and has to be very careful accordingly. Okay.
So that, I think, raises an interesting issue that I did also want to touch upon. I think we've talked about at different times throughout this conference. One, that the internet has evolved such that increasing, at this moment, although we're seeing some interesting diverges and new developments, that large platforms are often the places, due to the network effects mentioned, that is how we interact with each other and how we share content online. There are alternatives, both in terms of protocols, for example, that as Audrey, I think, said earlier, a podcast you can get from any podcast provider, email, what have you. And there is a move towards decentralized services when it comes to social media. That said, a lot of questions are out there about how concentration of economic power in digital services has had an impact on how those services run and ultimately how we can use them, including for the purposes of free speech. What does the structure of the AI industry look like right now, and how does that corporate structure kind of impact how we think about generative AI, its sort of potential and limitations for expression, and what kind of interventions we might want to think about to try to maximize, let's say, its expressive opportunity?
So, the structure of the AI ecosystem, because the term is vague, even if I narrow it down to generative AI, is very complicated. There are thousands and thousands of new companies in this space, but they have different roles. And so when you're talking about at the sort of building the frontier models, there aren't a lot of companies, because right now the computation to do that is very expensive. You do have some models that are produced at quite high cost that are then released. The model weights are released so that other people can use them. Meta has been doing this with its Llama models, and so that's a different structure. But it still costs a lot to run inference on these large models often, and so you have to pay, or you have to you pay. You need to get some scale, right? And so often you need big companies right now to do that. Now, there's lots of experiments on much narrower models that are smaller, that do, say, a specific set of tasks. Maybe they're customized to your certain set of data or a certain type of data, that can run on much smaller machines. Like I said, Hugging Face, you can download thousands and thousands of models that will run, probably poorly, on your PC. And I know companies like Apple are pushing to try to get on-device models that are that can do a lot of things, even if they're not as powerful as the biggest models. So, and that structure is changing rapidly as cost of compute comes down, algorithmic changes happen. And so the structure right now, I think, is one in which there are a few large providers of subscription services. There are a bunch of companies that orbit around those large providers who provide customized versions of those services through the APIs. And then there's lots of applications that are using some of those models, or they're using their own downloaded models, or they're paying Amazon to run a llama model, something like that. And so there are various areas that are concentrated, but under fierce competition, and there are areas that are very dispersed. And so and because of the lack of network effects generally, we're just talking about like scale, like benefits to scale, returns to scale, which can change because of technological change, whereas social media does not change because the inherent features of it is that you have to be connected to other people. So that structure doesn't quite change. So all of that's to say, I'm quite optimistic that the AI ecosystem is going to be one that is hugely distributed, that has lots of models that do lots of different things, but there will almost certainly be some large companies that provide services to lots of people because they're convenient, they're easy, and you trust them, and you don't have to do a lot to set them up. And so I think there'll be a wide range of options, much more so than I think probably in the social media space right now. Although, I will point out, if you look on Wikipedia for social media, there are like 100 different platforms right now. So there's a lot of those options there as well.
Can I offer something about free expression, which is the part of this question in the context of government regulation in particular? So a couple months ago, when people asked, this is before an election in India, when people asked Google Gemini, is Modi fascist? The Google Gemini reported that some experts have described him as exhibiting fascist tendencies. This led then to the Ministry of Information sending a little notice to Google saying, hey, we'd like to talk. And you wonder then, about the possibility that governments want to make governments are particularly sensitive when they are described in negative ways, right? This is true across the world. This would certainly be true if Donald Trump returns to the White House, but it's true if I think it's a shared impulse among liberal and conservative politicians in the United States and such across the world. By the way, being called fascist is exactly what an Austrian politician, and Joan mentioned this case before the Court of Justice of the European Union. The Austrian politician said, hey, you can't call me fascist, that's illegal. Okay, and this case went up to the highest court in the European Union, which said Austria could actually order Meta or Facebook to remove, if it went through a process, okay, if Austria did the right things, it was consistent with European law to order Meta to remove any reference to this woman being called fascist or an oath or a corrupt oath, okay? Or an equivalent language, okay, or in any equivalent language. Think about all the ways you might be called fascist across the world, okay? So that's what the CJEU determined. Joan is the real expert here on this matter, but, and I think that case is, I'll try pronouncing it, Glowacnik Pajek. Eva Glowacnik, her first name is very easy, Glowacnik Pajek. But I had to remind myself before I got back so this is an issue of governments are keen on basically being able to say, hey, you can't say this about a politician. And this will now come into the realm of AI chatbot. This is the version of truth we want you to say. We don't want you to say the truth as you see it. We want you to say the truth as we see it.
So maybe actually building on that, what should companies who are building and deploying these models be thinking about in terms of how, we talk a lot about red teaming and sort of adversarial kind of thinking when it comes to trust and safety. How do we prepare for the pressure that's coming when it comes to this?
Can I just add something, and then I am happy to take that question. But but one of the interesting things about sort of the industry and the landscape you're describing, if you kind of go back during the early days of .com when we got everything wrong, I'm joking, is like the startups can just raise money and build and sort of become a thing. Now all the big companies are backing to some degree those like AI labs, right? And that has implication for competition, for opportunity, and that also has implication in terms of broader rights. And that is one of the perspectives for Meta offering the open source, and Llama really gives opportunity for others to compete on a broader scale. But then just kind of going back to the speech angle, there are two areas where I think that helps also to expand the speech. One is making it more local. So you can, if you are in India or Russia or Armenia, I don't know about Russia actually, but you can download and you can just kind of train on your language and make it more locally usable. And also you can just kind of figure out what is the use case for you. So I think from that perspective, that expands access. In terms of how we should think about what should these models govern, I think that is a very, very hard question. And I think one of the ways in which that those models are sort of designed or try to output is to say, look, here are different sort of opinions, here are different sides, so you can make your opinion in a way. So, and I think that's a question, when someone is like directly prompting, no, give me this opinion. If someone is asking like, no, tell me that X government, X president is fascist or whatever is your favorite word, like what is the response? And I think that's going to be a tricky one.
Can I add just really quick to that? I think that overall, governments I think they will try to do this, right? But I think the large number of models that are out there suggests that it will be hard to do it. And also, the bottleneck in creating, bad speech about a government has almost never been creation. Like you can create content. I mean, it's not hard to call somebody a cumbersome oaf or whatever it was. Like you don't need an AI to generate that content. So I think their focus will continue to be where it is right now, which is on the distribution of content and putting pressure on those, because those are the real bottlenecks. And that's where I think the threat to free speech is. As long as we keep tons and tons of models, and they can have lots of different variations in how they generate content, and they're trained different ways. That looks like the future. As long as we keep that, I think free speech as far as the model level is going to be pretty safe. The threats will still be in distribution.
So I think now we can open it up to the audience for questions. So we have the microphones on both sides, and I see Jakob heading towards one.
Race to it first. Thanks. So when we talk about restrictions, sort of guardrails, should we think about where the restrictions are more permissive, the more agentic it is? So if, for instance, I interact with a chatbot in an airport to provide some kind of service, it's quite reasonable that it doesn't sort of spew racist hate speech and so on, or in the workplace. But whereas when I use OpenAI, I sort of a year ago I asked it to explain, Lenny Bruce's humor. Lenny Bruce, the famous U.S. comedian who got a conviction for obscenity, and it wouldn't. I prompted it again and again. It would not give me the details of Lenny Bruce's material. I tried running it again. It seems that it's less concerned about Bruce these days. There was a time where I could not get Gemini to tell me the controversial parts of Spinoza, which I thought, wow, that's the Catholic Church was revindicated. But but the more agentic, the more specific the purpose, I guess, the less concerned we should be about the guardrails and how do we operationalize that?
I would think about that largely about economic incentives. I mean, the more, like the example that you gave, insulting your customers at using an AI is really bad business. So I would hope that they are really concerned about keeping that. So those types of business cases, I think, I'm not sure how much intervention needs to happen. There's probably like really strong incentives to not go there.
It's a great point about asking these efforts to kind of jailbreak these systems from their training and their guardrails is fascinating. And so asking these companies' models to report on what someone said, which is negative about a particular group, would be a way to manipulate it into saying something negative about a group, right? So I think I can see why OpenAI would resist and resist and resist, right? Even though, of course, that is history, an essential history, and a history of Western civilization that you're asking about, which is fascinating. But I can also see the kind of panic of these companies if they are seen as saying, the Catholic Church is this, or even the litany of complaints that Luther had. These would all be things that perhaps become worrisome for the economic incentives of these companies. So, in this sense, you've got the kind of maverick in the room, which would be Elon Musk's AI, Grok, which seems to have fewer. It's the anti-woke AI, right? And so maybe you can get it to spew hate speech, or so that might constitute hate speech, right? That's the question. So it's depending on how one defines all these things, but because if it says negative things about a particular religion, et cetera. So I think you're in a very difficult space, but there is the possibility that you have models that are Llama is going to be trained with guardrails and released with guardrails, right? But you have other open source.
It is already.
Yeah. So it's not. What I mean is, it is already. When I say is always going to be trained in this way, because it tries to be responsible, and it's worried about being its chatbot saying things that might then be reported back as ascribable to Meta, and so I think you're going to see other open source models that will be less restrained.
So let's take 2 more questions and then see how we do in terms of time. So we'll go over there and then come back over to here.
Sure. Okay. So just want to put a couple quick things on the table and then see if you. So one of the concerns that I had, or question, building on Jakob's, is things about possible political bias that's kind of written into codes and based on the programmers' interpretations of what constitutes. So for instance, if you try to get a lot of chat systems to write positive poetry about Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, it has no problem. If you say, write me a positive poem about Donald Trump's virtues, it says, I'm sorry, I can't do that in many cases, because the programmers seem to conflate saying anything positive about Donald Trump as an example of hate speech or something like that. So I was wondering, how you all think about the risk of bias and kind of tensions in that arena. And then real quick, another question that I had, just to get your sense while you're here. I was reading something recently that a lot of these generative AI systems, when they're trying to generate stuff based on other content that was produced from AIs, also, there's kind of this problem. It has a problem generating stuff based on other generated content. You kind of have model collapse. As more people are using and producing work, using generative AI that's getting published in media outlets and academic things, and how do you think about that problem kind of long term? It's kind of orthogonal to freedom of speech, but I'm just curious since I have some smarties in the room about it.
Great. Let's do one more question, and then we'll go down the row with closing remarks.
Going about down the same thing. I was trained in journalism, and before I started working, I had to take a course in defamation and how much trouble you could get in by posting false information. You could get your organization sued and run out of business. Now we have all kinds of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation described online. I don't know what the consequences are if those are proved to be such. I just don't, I'm sure AI people will program their generative product not to say really mean things, but it's going to be a different kind of conversation. Am I wrong?
Maybe we can start with the political bias question and then move to misinformation. I think the political bias question and generally bias question is a very, very important one, and one that we think all the time. I was like, are you spying me? Like, this is like the thing I'm working all the time. But the reason I say this because, I think there's two problems. One is what we expect these chatbots to produce, and forgetting that how they have been trained on. So I think it's very critical what is the training data. So one of the mitigation tactics there is really to make sure you have a good data set and that is diverse and also globally representative. So that's kind of one mitigation. On the issue of political bias, the other sort of mitigation that we're thinking through is like strategic pre-training. So not only just making sure that data is good and diverse, but also looking through, make sure that it's strategically pre-trained. But one challenge that you might see now, especially asking sort of current issue questions, is the training data cutoff. So when, for example, Meta AI, when there is a question that is, let's say, what happened yesterday during the debate, for example, then it's the training data is before that. So what the model does, it goes and serves the internet and then sort of shows the content, what they found. And the problem is, yes, there is bias everywhere, including in our search results. So in a way, you end up getting like a biased sources. That's, of course, is a challenge, but it's not the challenge of the GenAI model in and of itself. It's a challenge of how the system is working and where the information is coming. On the misinfo, I mean, we at Meta have policies that if something is rising to the level that it can lead to imminent physical harm, we will remove that content. And again, I think misinformation challenge with AI is the hallucination. And it's, again, the challenge with the data. So oftentimes, if the model doesn't have the training, it just gives you the best possible version of the answer. And it always, and often hallucinates. So I think that's one challenge that is known and something that we should all collectively work on. I don't think there is just a magic wand to address the hallucination problem.
Okay. Very brief, because we are now at time.
Really brief. So, you know, the AI bias, political bias problem can happen at lots of different layers. You heard it at the data layer, but it can also be in the reinforcement learning through human feedback layer, and it can be in the meta prompts that go in. They all have different solutions. I think the key answer here is that we have lots of different models produced by lots of different people who have lots of different value sets. And then, you know, everybody try to do the best job given their particular bias. I think that's the right solution. And I'm happy to talk to you about the synthetic data problem later.
So quickly, I think the risks of bias, the risk of defamation, those are serious problems. The companies are clearly aware of this. They're trying to address it. Now, the question of the coder in the room who is pushing things one way or the other, Elon Musk's lackey, we can imagine a hypothetical, pushing his agenda, et cetera. And that is a very difficult question, and it requires, you know, so people say, oh, you need to see the code, et cetera. Sometimes I really wonder about how much we learn from the actual code. So really, you have to test it again and again and again. These models don't produce consistent answers, like we're told. So you need third parties to try it too, because sometimes You have to be careful about the people doing the report because they have biases. So it can be, this is a very difficult challenge. But it's one that humanity has always had. We've always had biased reporting. This is an affliction of humanity. The New York Times was never the neutral observer that it claimed to be. This was the Hearst papers. The history of all media is exactly this. So this is a problem of humanity, and so I think we should know that we have survived it in the past. We should keep on endeavoring to survive it in the future.
I think putting this in historical and human perspective is a great way to end this panel. Let's thank our panel. Thanks very much.